Okay, could somebody please confirm you can hear me?
We can hear you. I can.
We've
Thank you.
got you.
Good, I can see myself, but once again, I'm sideways. I'm not sure what's going on. My Zoom. I'm not sure we're on this chapter, but let me take a look here. So today is January 14th, and we should be finishing chapter 1 and beginning chapter 2. Let me remind you, you have a quiz. It's a practice quiz 00. It'll be over the syllabus Labs 0 and Lab 1, and Chapter 1. Any question about any of that? This quiz is on Wednesday, by the way. All right, so let's go to Chapter 1. Are there any questions on anything? So I had that we were talked about this slide last time, saying that the normal microbiota do not normally cause disease, although they can cause disease in certain circumstances, like in AIDS patients, for example, or cancer patients receiving chemotherapy where the medication weakens their immune system. Sometimes the normal microbiota can overcome the host defenses and then cause disease. If it does cause disease, it's not usually called a pathogen. It's called an opportunistic infection. So infectious disease result when a pathogen overcomes the host resistance, and disease is normally caused by a pathogenic microbe, a organism capable of causing disease. Understand that very few bacteria are pathogens. An emerging infectious disease is a new or changing disease that is either increasing or has the ability to increase in incidence in the future. Can anyone mention an emerging infectious disease? Nobody knows an emerging infectious disease. What are
Nope.
we
Hantavirus?
possibly? I'm not sure about that one, but it could increase in frequency. To my knowledge, it has not increased in frequency recently.
Are you referring to COVID-19?
Yeah, COVID-19 is an emerging infectious disease because it initially, I don't remember how many, 2019. So, gosh, this is our fifth year of it in the United States. It started in 2019 in China, but that was December. So just recently was 5 years even there. Um, Before that, it had never even hit the human population. So that would be one emerging infectious disease, which initially increased. It's no longer probably increasing, and it's probably no longer going to potentially increase. Another potential emerging infectious disease is bird flu. Scientists have been watching this now for, gosh, over 10 years. They're concerned that bird flu may evolve and then spread among humans. If you don't know, bird flu is, well, lethal to humans. I don't know what the lethality rate is, but it has a fairly high lethality rate when humans get it. But fortunately, when humans get bird flu, it doesn't spread person to person. To get bird flu, you have to be in close contact with birds and you pick it up from the birds. It does spread bird to bird, but it's not generally lethal among birds. Any question about any of that? So you need to know the definition of an emerging infectious disease. You don't really need to know anything else about emerging infectious disease. If you want to learn more about them on your own, you can go through these additional slides and read about it. I'm not going to be covering this topic. I almost never do. Ebola hemorrhagic fever uh, was an emerging infectious disease. At the moment, I don't think there are any cases, at least among humans. So we can't say it's emerging at that point, but um, I don't remember when it was, maybe as far as 10 years ago, where it bloomed and hit more people than it ever had. Uh, AIDS with started by HIV virus, first identified in 1981, but they actually found a few cases of it in the United States as back as early as 1960s. And fortunately, in the United States and the rest of the world, AIDS and HIV did not spread. Like I said, it wasn't until 1981 that it started spreading in the United States and the rest of the world. But they've gone back in Africa and found that it was slowly spreading in Africa from about 1950. And there's some concern that actually the African hospitals may have inadvertently spread HIV, which actually made it a worldwide threat, starting in the 1950s. And what happened was the African hospitals would reuse the needles when they would use a needle on a patient. They would reuse it and not sterilize the needles between patients. And they did that to save money. I don't know if HIV is still considered an emerging infectious disease because, like I said, it emerged in the United States really in 1981. And that's a long time ago. That's over 40 years, over 45, almost 55 years ago. All right. Any question about emerging infectious diseases? If not, let's end chapter 1. Any questions about chapter 1? And let's go on with chapter 2. Chapter 2, Chemical Principles. In this slide, like almost all the first slides in the chapters, I give you the major goals and a rough outline. Now, please realize these are just the major goals. If you want to know all of the goals, you need to go find the objectives, which you can find by coming to the overview and the objectives of chapter 2. Any question about any of that? While I'm here and I'm thinking about it, let me make the chapter 1 and chapter 10 notes available for you, the slideshow available to you. I will make them available after we finish the class. Any question about any of that? All right. So the rough outline, always know the terms. We'll talk about organic and inorganic compounds, hydrocarbons, polar and nonpolar molecules, hydrogen bonds, acid, bases, and what the pH is. 2, with respect to the 4 major biological molecules, be able to describe the relationships and the characteristics between the monomers and the polymers, and B, be able to describe the composition, structure, and function of each of the four major biological molecules, and then be able to give examples of each. What are the four major biological molecules? You can find three of them on any cereal box or any food item that you eat. So what do you find on a cereal box? Nobody's going to state anything?
Carbohydrates,
Carbohydrates, that's a biological molecule. What else?
proteins,
Protein. It's a biological molecule. What do you have down on your belly?
Lipids or fats.
Yeah, lipids. Fats are a term we use in common usage. Lipids is a little more general, referring to all of the fat-like molecules. So we'll go with lipids. And then the fourth one you do not find on, as far as I'm aware of, any cereal box or anything you buy, and that would be nucleic acids. These four major biological molecules are only found in something that is alive or was once alive, meaning if you find it in a fossil, it's because it was made by something that was once alive. You do not find these four biological molecules on a rock from the moon or any other rock from outer space because they only come about in something that was once alive. Any questions about any of that? All right, this is showing you the scale of things. Let me blow this up. Sorry, this is a little chewier than I thought it would be. You need to know the scale of things. You need to know a human is bigger than a chicken egg, which is bigger than a frog egg, which is bigger than most eukaryotic cell. Realize a frog egg and a chicken egg is one cell, a eukaryote, but most eukaryotic cells are much smaller, which is bigger than a bacteria, which is bigger than a virus, which is bigger than a large molecule like a a protein. When did I say prion? And it's bigger than a small molecule like water, which is bigger than atoms. So you just need to know the relative order of things. You do not need to know the sizes. You should also know that the light microscope can see down to the smallest bacteria, or almost, and up to about the size of a frog egg. And to see things smaller than that, you need an electron microscope, which can see down to about the size of an atom. And then things larger than a frog egg, or as small as a frog egg, can be seen by the human eye. Any question about any of that? All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about organic compounds. What are they? Well, they're typically complex structures. They typically have carbon in them. Carbon is important because carbon combined to four other atoms. They're held together mostly by covalent chemical bonds. Organic compounds always contain carbon and hydrogen, but they may contain other atoms, particularly oxygen, and there can be some others as well. Inorganic compounds typically lack carbon. Not all of them lack carbon, but most of them do. Inorganic compounds are required by living organisms for the organism's growth, repair, maintenance, and reproduction. Some examples of an inorganic compound includes oxygen and water, very important compounds for living organisms, as well as carbon dioxide, which you'll note carbon dioxide is an inorganic compound, but it does contain carbon. Water is one of the most important and abundant molecules in all things alive. Any question about any of that? You'll note we haven't really talked about what an organic compound is, but we'll come back to it. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about water, a little more. Water is an important molecule. It is also a polar molecule. A polar molecule is one where the electrons between the hydrogen and the oxygen are not shared equally between the hydrogen and the oxygen, meaning the oxygen pulls a little more on the electron, so that electron gets a partial electric charge, partial negative charge. And your book doesn't call it a partial charge. What does it call it? A slight charge. Tortora calls it a slight charge. It's not a complete -1 charge. It is a partial charge. The hydrogen has a partial plus charge because the electron is not spending equal time among the hydrogen. So it doesn't have a +1, but it has a partial positive charge. That means water has a partial negative on one end, the oxygen, and a partial positive on the hydrogens. The polarity of water allows for water to form hydrogen bonds, where the partial negative oxygen will be attracted to the partial positive hydrogen by an electromagnetic attraction, meaning negative is attracted to the positive. We call that attraction a hydrogen bond. Note that water has two chemical bonds. Inside the water molecule, it has a covalent bond linking the hydrogen to the oxygen, and this is a polar covalent bond. It also has hydrogen bonds between different water molecules, assuming that's a liquid or a solid, and that we call a hydrogen bond. Any question about any of that? Let me open the link and we'll watch a little video on the water molecule. No, that's right. This movie isn't as good. I gotta find another good movie. I had a good movie and it didn't, they no longer have it on YouTube, so. Two water molecules. A positive with the hydrogens, and then the negative with the oxygen. And then the water molecule can be attracted, the negative oxygen to the positive hydrogen. That is called a hydrogen bond. Hydrogen bonds are actually what makes, I don't have anything that you can see through, what makes water a liquid. Well, this is tea, that's good enough. Let me wait until, and there you can see water. When water is a liquid, can you guys see the liquid in this glass here? Let me stop the share and then I can see. You can sort of see it in there.
A little bit.
Yeah, I can't tip it too much. Let me see if I can bend this down a little. There, that's better. There you can
Now
see.
we can see it.
Yeah, and the reason why it is a liquid is because the hydrogen bonds are attaching the water molecules to each other. If the hydrogen bonds weren't attaching the water molecules to each other, we'd have water vapor, meaning gaseous water. And the reason why it's a liquid is because those hydrogen bonds break and reform all the time, which allows the liquid to be a liquid and then can take the shape of the container and move about and wiggle, whatever you want to call it. We can make it so those hydrogen bonds don't ever break. And what do we call that? Anyone have a guess? What happens when you have water and the hydrogen bonds don't break? Well, it's not a liquid because the hydrogen bonds are not breaking and then reforming. If they break and reform, that allows you to have a liquid.
Is
If
it cohesion?
No, if they never break, then we have ice. And
Sounds
that's
like a
why ice
solid.
is a solid, and that's because the hydrogen bonds do not break and reform. So you don't have a liquid, instead you have a solid. So the water molecules are locked in place by the hydrogen bonds, and that's why it's a solid. Any question about any of that? All right, so remember water has two chemical bonds, a covalent bond inside the water molecule, and why you have liquid water, hydrogen bonds between the water molecules. And these hydrogen bonds can break and reform all the time while you have liquid water. If you have gaseous water, the hydrogen bond breaks and it doesn't reform. If you have ice, then the hydrogen bond forms and it never breaks. And then the water is locked in place, and that's why it's a solid. All right, water is a good solvent. All polar molecules and ions dissolve in water. Sugar is a polar molecule, similar to water, and polar likes being around polar, and so sugar will dissolve in water. Any question about that? I'll show you how in just a little minute. Ionic molecules can also dissolve in water. An ion is a substance that is made up of positive and negatively charged atoms, like sodium chloride, where here is a crystal of sodium chloride, and that is the chloride ion. It contains a -1 charge. The sodium is also an atom with a charge, a +1 charge. And what happens is the electron from sodium moves to chloride, and that makes the sodium a +1 charge and the chloride a -1 charge. This salt crystal can form because the negative charge will be attracted to the positive charge. And then you get a crystalline structure of this, which if you ever saw a salt crystal, it forms from chloride ions binding to sodium ions simply by the electric attraction between the atoms. And this is called an ionic bond, where the chloride ion is attracted to the sodium ion. Any question about that? Meaning there is no electrons forming a chemical bond. The attraction is the -1 charge is attracted to the +1 charge. Water, which is a polar molecule like this, can come up to, let's say, that molecule there, and the positive charged hydrogen will come up and start surrounding the -1 of the chloride ion, and then bring that chloride ion out of the crystal and in solution where it will be surrounded by water, and the water will have lots of hydrogen, partial hydrogens of the water molecules, lots of the water molecules facing the -1 charge of the chloride ion. And then this can go in solution because the partial positives will equal out the -1 charge. And that will pull this ion out of the crystal and make it still an ion in the water. And then the water will be in the water over here. There will be other water molecules attached to this because this will be the negative oxygen. You'll have the hydrogen bonding to that water. Anyways, that's how water pulls a ionic molecule out of its crystal structure, making salt water in this case, where the sodium chloride is surrounded by water, but in this case, the oxygens will be pointing towards the sodium, and then the chloride will have the hydrogens pointing towards the -1 chloride ion. Any question about any of that? So that's why an ionic substance, meaning something made out of positive and negative charges, can be dissolved in water. And then something like sugar, which if you have a sugar cube, for example, and you put it in water, water will come up to the sugar, and it doesn't quite form like this because sugar won't be a -1 charge. It'll be an ionic molecule, and the negative partial charge of the sugar will be surrounded by the positive hydrogens of water, and then the positive partial charge of the sugar will be surrounded by the negative oxygens of water, and that's how sugar can dissolve and become, what do you call sugar water? Sugar water, whatever you call that, sweetened water. Any question about any of that? All right. Let me stop the share. I don't need it so big. Oops, not stop the share. That's not what I wanted to do. Let's start the share again. I want to stop the in the show. Here we go. So water is a good solvent because it can dissolve all polar molecules and ionic molecules. Polar molecules are molecules which are hydrophilic. That means literally water lover. It means that a polar molecule can dissolve in water. Hydrophilic means that it can dissolve in water. And all polar molecules are hydrophilic. All ionic molecules are also hydrophilic. Nonpolar molecules are repelled by water. We say they are hydrophobic. Literally, that means fear of water. What it really means is they do not dissolve in water. Oil and fats are hydrophobic. As you know, if you ever made salad dressing, you put vinegar, which is mostly water, and you add usually some water and spices in it. And then you add something like olive oil or other oil, and you shake it up. The oil will separate from the vinegar and the water. And that's because oil is hydrophobic. It is nonpolar molecules. It will not dissolve in the water. Any question about any of that? Let me see if I have an example of a nonpolar molecule. An example of a non-polar molecule is the hydrogen gas. Let me get a new file here. Actually, a paint would be better. Let me try paint. So we have an atom here, which is going to be hydrogen, and another atom here, which is hydrogen. They then have two electrons forming an ionic bond between the hydrogens. those electrons will be pulled equally by both atoms because hydrogen is the same. So each hydrogen will pull on that electron, forming the covalent bond equally. That will make a non-polar covalent bond. Hydrogens are shared equally between the atoms of hydrogen. And that means hydrogen gas is nonpolar. Any question about any of that? That means that hydrogen gas would not dissolve in water, but it may dissolve in like something, a lipid like oil. And if you know, butter, for example, is nonpolar, and it will not dissolve in water, but it will dissolve in oil. You might have to heat it up, but once you heat it up, it would dissolve in oil. Any question about any of that? All right. Hydrogen bonds make water excellent at buffering the temperature. Because we live in Western Washington or Oregon, you guys should know this. Our temperature is buffered because of the water of the Pacific Ocean. And then Eastern Washington and Eastern Oregon, their temperature is not buffered. And that's why they get much hotter in the summer and much colder in the winter. In the western part of these two states, I imagine California as well, the temperature is buffered by the water of the Pacific Ocean. Why water is so good at buffering the temperature is because it takes energy to break the hydrogen bonds between the water molecules. And then the water molecules themselves can also absorb energy. Whereas when you have something like oil and you apply heat to it, there is only one thing that can absorb the energy, and that would be the molecules of oil. So the molecules of oil or the molecules of water, when they absorb the energy of applying heat to it, that will cause the molecules to move and vibrate more rapidly. The movement of the molecules is actually the temperature. So the hotter the temperature, the more the molecules are moving, the more they are vibrating. Any question about any of that? And with oil, that's all there is to absorb the energy when you apply it to the oil or as heat. It'll be absorbed only by the molecules. Whereas if you give the same amount of energy to water, the temperature of the water will raise less than the oil because some of that energy will be absorbed by the water molecules. And so those water molecules will be moving faster and vibrating faster or more. And that will raise the water temperature. But you also have the hydrogen bonds, which can absorb the energy. And so the temperature of water will raise less than the temperature of oil if you give the two the same amount of energy. Any question about any of that? All right, I think that's it. Anyways, because water has two things that can absorb energy, it is excellent at buffering the temperature. Water can be split into H+ ions and OH- ions, at least on the planet Earth. If you were at the surface of the sun, you can split water into two H+ molecules and one O negative 2, not molecules, sorry, atoms, and one negative 2 atom, which we'll call an ion. But on the planet Earth, water does not split that way. We don't have enough energy. It's not hot enough on the planet Earth to do that. And so H2O in this water here, for example, well, it's not water there, right here, if you can see it in the T, can split from H2O into H plus ion and OH minus, which we call the hydroxide ion. The H plus ion is also called a proton, but we'll call it H plus ion. That will make some charged molecules in the water. So H2O will have some H plus and OH minus ions in it. And that charged molecule or water breaking apart will give the water the pH of the water. Any question about any of that? We'll talk more about the pH in a little bit. The pH is actually a measure of the amount of H plus in the water. Here we're looking at a pH scale. When you have pure water, that is 100% H2O, or it has the same number of H plus ions in solution as it does OH ions in solution, it will be pH 7. If you have more H plus ions in solution than you have OH ions in solution, then you'll have an acid. And we have increasing acidity from pH 7 down to pH 0. The pH scale runs from 0 to 14. We'll talk exactly what this pH scale means in a little bit, but let me just briefly explain. So pure water having the same H plus concentration as OH will be pH 7. Slightly more acidic, you'll have pH 6. Urine's around pH 6. pH 5, more acidic. pH 4, more acidic. Wine and tomato juice are around pH 4. Grapefruit juice around pH 3, even more acidic. Lemon juice, even more acidic, around pH 2. Stomach acid is around pH 1.5, depending on what you ate, when you ate. The only thing I know that's more acidic than stomach acid is the acid in your car battery, and that's around pH 1. At pH 0, all of the water it's all of the minus has disappeared, and all you have is H plus in the water, pH 0. We'll talk more about that in a minute. All right. If you have more OH minus ions in solution than H plus, you have a base, also called an alkaline solution, and you get increasing basicness. Seawater a little higher than pH 8. You can get pH 9, even more basic, pH 10, around the pH of milk of magnesia. Household ammonia above pH 11. Household bleach a little above pH 12. Oven cleaner will be the thing that is the most basic thing you guys have probably ever experienced. It's above pH 13. And then the highest thing you can get is pH 14. You don't know what lime water is, but that's a pH 14. Any question about any of that? Anyways, that's the pH scale. Let me talk a little bit about pH. pH is actually the amount of H plus in a solution. So the pH is the measure of the negative log of the H plus concentration. The pH scale ranges from 0 to 14. It's a log scale. That means whenever you change the pH number by 1, you change the pH concentration by 10-fold. So a change from pH 6 to 7, I guess I should go the other way, pH 7 to 6, you're increasing the hydrogen ion concentration by 10-fold. Any question about any of that? Let me open up a file here. So at pH equal to 7, this means that we have equal H plus and OH minus, but it also is a measure of the pH concentration. And at pH 7, we have 1 hydrogen ion. Oops. Come on. Sorry, I'm not seeing my keyboard well. For every 1 times 10 to the 7th water molecule, we'll go H2O. Let me superscript that. Don't see it there. There it is. And that superscript, and let's subscript that one. And I'll blow this up so you can see it better. So at pH 7, we have 1 hydrogen ion for every 1 times 10 to the 7th water molecules. Any question about that? At pH 6, let me go up here. Oops. At pH 6, we increase the hydrogen ions 10-fold, meaning we have now 1 hydrogen ion for every 10 to the 6 water molecules. Let's see if I can get that again. Probably have the return there is the trouble. Yep. And then this continues for pH 5. We have 1 hydrogen ion for every 1 times 10 to the 5th water molecules. Any question about that? And then for pH 8, obviously, we have something similar. You have 1 hydrogen ion for every 1 times 10 to the 8th water molecules. And that's the pH scale. Any questions about it? Already talked about that. Most organisms grow best between a pH of 6 to 8, meaning they grow best around pH 7. And if you get too acidic or too basic, most organisms, well, they're going to get sick and eventually not grow or die. And that's true of most bacteria. They grow best around pH 7. Any question about any of that? All right. Let me talk a little bit about, let me move that around. Let me talk about acid, bases, and salts. An acid is a substance that dissociates, giving up 1 or more H plus ions in solution. Like if you have water and you add HCl to the water, the HCl will dissociate into H plus ions and Cl minus ions, like here. and that will make the water more acidic because you'll increase the H plus concentration in the water. And that's why HCl is an acid. Any question about that? Your base says a base is a substance that, when it dissolves in water, will give up one or more OH minus ions. Remember, that's the hydroxide ion. And they'll tell you that sodium hydroxide is a base because when sodium hydroxide dissolves in water, it'll form Na plus and OH minus, and that OH minus will increase the OH minuses in solution, making the water more basic. Any question about that? Your textbook does not discuss it, but when we put bicarbonate in water, like baking soda, sodium bicarbonate, the bicarbonate HCO3 minus 1 will break down into, oh, I got that going backwards, sorry. Let's go ahead and go here. I never noticed that was not what I was talking about. So sodium bicarbonate, I'm not sure of the chemical formula of that. Let's get rid of that. Oh, that's actually not hydrogen, but sodium. Let's go -2. Gotta get that. No, that's a -1, sorry. I think. Oh, here we go. That's a -1 with the H there. Don't see my. Print, but actually that's pretty good. That should be a superscript. Oop. Come on. Yeah. There we go. So when you put sodium bicarbonate in water, it'll dissociate into C plus and HCO3. Oop, that should be a small 3. And let's see if I can just grab it from there. This isn't what I want. Actually, I want this to absorb the hydrogen ion. So I did have it right. Anyways, when you put this in water, it can absorb the hydrogen ions, creating bicarbonate. And that would be something like sodium bicarbonate to get that. So let me erase that. My question is, you've now absorbed the hydrogen ions from this solution. Will that be a base or an acid? Nobody wants to guess. If you remove the hydrogen ions in the solution, you will make it more basic because the pH is a measure of the amount of hydrogen acids or H plus ions in solution. So if you add this to water, it'll remove the hydrogen ions, increasing the pH to making it more basic. And this is a base, even though it does not dissociate into OH minus. So a base should really be called something that either dissociates, giving off an OH minus ion, or something that absorbs an H plus ion. And you're going to have to get that from my lecture because the textbook does not discuss this as a base. Meaning you absorb the H plus, it's a base. And that's why if you put sodium bicarbonate into water, you will have a basic solution. Sodium bicarbonate is baking soda, by the way. Any question about any of that? All right, let's move on. A salt is a substance that dissociates into a cation, something that has a positive charge. It's a positive 1 or positive 2. And an anion, something that has a negative charge, either a negative 1 or a negative 2, neither of which are H plus ion or OH minus ion. So a salt is not something that dissociates into H plus ion or OH minus, because that would be an acid or a base. An example of a salt is sodium chloride or table salt, which will, when you dissolve it in water, will break down from sodium chloride into sodium ions, +1, and chloride ion, -1. So table salt is a salt, but also magnesium chloride, magnesium 2 chloride ions can break down into magnesium +2 and then 2 chloride minus ions. And magnesium chloride is by chemistry called a salt because it breaks down into cations and anions. Any question about any of that? So remember, when we're using the term salt, we're meaning table salt. We're not meaning a chemist's definition of a salt, because magnesium chloride is a chemist's definition of a salt. Electrolytes are a substance that breaks down into ions, cations and anions, when you put it in water. And an electrolyte is something that can conduct electricity in the water. If you don't know, salt water, shown here, can conduct electricity much better than pure water, because pure water has very few charged molecules, but salt water has sodium and chloride in it, and it conducts electricity very nicely. That's why during an electric storm, you should not be in the ocean or anything that's salt water, because if the lightning were to hit the ocean, it could travel and injure you, even if the lightning hits far away. Whereas again, if you're in fresh water, the lightning has to be really close to you, the strike, before it could really injure you. Meaning if it's far away, it's not going to injure you because the lightning will not travel in the fresh water. Any question about any of that? All right. Let's come and talk about organic compounds. An organic compound is a substance that always contains hydrogen and carbon. It may contain other elements like acetic acid. I don't even know what this compound is. Phospholipid does have oxygen in it. So it can contain other atoms, particularly oxygen, but they always contain hydrogen and carbon. The simplest organic compounds are hydrocarbons, and they only contain carbon and hydrogen, like methane gas, ethane gas, propane, only contain hydrogen and carbon, butane, pentane. You don't need to memorize this list, by the way. I'm just trying to show you some organic compounds. Most organic compounds are fairly complex, like this phospholipid here, or these organic compounds here. I can't even read what those are. Let me blow that up so I can read it. I don't know what these are. Benzopyrene right there. Most organic compounds are complex. Acetic acid is fairly complex, although it's fairly simple too. The simplest organic compound is methane, and that's C4. Most organic compounds have large chains with mainly carbon atoms holding the chain together, meaning most of the, oops, what did I do there? There we go. Most of the atoms are bound by a covalent chemical bond, and most of them are bound to the carbon. Like these hydrogen were all bound to the carbon. These two hydrogen are bound to the carbon. And except for right here, where there's an oxygen, obviously that happens there and there too, most of the linking is carbon to carbon. And that's the way organic compounds are. They're mostly held together by a carbon skeleton. Organic compounds, as I stated, always contain carbon and hydrogen. Many of them contain oxygen, not all of them, but many do. And some other elements may be in organic compounds as well, particularly nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus. They're all held together by chemically covalent bond, so a chemical covalent bond. Some organic compounds, obviously the methane, hexane, whatever that I showed earlier, but amino acids, carbohydrates, nucleotides, lipids. Come on, go away. Various hydrocarbons, all are organic compounds. Compared to inorganic molecules, they are more complex, and they're capable of more complicated biological functions. Some examples of an organic compound: methanol here, ethanol, methane, which is CH4. They're usually held together by carbon, like all of these atoms are held together by carbon. So we call it this carbon skeleton or the carbon backbone. And when we look here, most of them are held together by carbon. There is one oxygen here, here, and there holding it together, but most of them are held together by the carbon. You can have a functional group that can bind to the molecule of the organic compound. The functional group gives this molecule different properties than methane alone. Meaning if you had hydrogen there, methane, we can add a functional group, take off the hydrogen, put on the OH. OH is a functional group. It gives this molecule different properties than methane alone. For example, methanol, having the OH functional group, can dissolve in water. Methane, lacking the OH, being a CH4, cannot dissolve in water. It is nonpolar. The OH group is a polar molecule, and it makes this whole molecule polar. Any question about any of that? Functional groups are important because they can influence the chemical behavior of the organic compound. Functional groups are responsible for most of the chemical and physical properties of a particular organic chemical compound or molecule. The OH group in alcohols is hydrophilic. I already mentioned that. So it can make the molecule attracted to water. And that's why an alcohol like ethanol can dissolve in water, whereas ethane gas cannot dissolve in water. The different functional groups you need to know are the functional groups surrounded by the red box. So you need to know the alcohol, the OH group, because it's very common in lipids, carbohydrates, and proteins. You need to know the amino group, and that's the NH2 group. It's common in proteins and amino acids. That's why it's called an amino acid, because it is the amine group. You need to know the carboxyl group, COOH, and that first O has a double carbon bond, meaning two covalent bonds to the carbon. Carboxyl groups are found in organic acids, lipids, proteins. And then there's the phosphate group, that's PO4 with two negative charges. That's complete charge there and there, so two negative. You find phosphate groups in ATP, DNA, and RNA. Why do you need to know the groups shown in the red boxes? Besides, I tell you, what do you notice about them? Okay, nobody's giving a guess. I'm going to move on. You need to know these groups because they're very common in the four biological molecules: fats, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. Small organic molecules can combine into larger molecules that we call macromolecules. Macromolecules are also called polymers, consisting of many small repeating molecules called a monomer. So you can combine this monomer with that monomer to make a polymer where the R of this one binds to the R of this one. The H comes off, the OH comes off, forming water. We'll talk a little bit more about this probably next time. That's called the condensation reaction or dehydration synthesis reaction. I think those two are synonymous. And then you can take the RR group, which is a polymer, and combine it with water and go this way. That's known as hydrolysis, having the water split this polymer into the monomers, and the water will split up, the OH going to this R and the H of this water going to the R there. So dehydration is the mechanism for synthesis of macromolecules. You can use dehydration synthesis to make a larger molecule, and then you can use hydrolysis to make a smaller molecule. You need dehydration synthesis for the body to make carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins from smaller molecules, which we'll call monomers at this point. So this is showing you dehydration synthesis where a monomer with an OH group on the monomer coming to the polymer. This is a shorter polymer, the H group there. The H group comes off this polymer, binding to that monomer to form water. And then that monomer links directly to this polymer, making a larger polymer. And that's dehydration synthesis, such as when your body is making glycogen from eating some sugar, like glucose. And then if your body needs glucose in the blood, you can take this glycogen, like in your liver, and with hydrolysis, bring in water, split the water into the H plus coming to this part of the glycogen, which is a little smaller glycogen molecule now, and then the OH of water coming to that monomer, and then this glucose will then be glucose, which will be released into the blood, the monomer. Any question about any of that? All right, so let's talk a little bit about the carbohydrates. Carbohydrates include sugars, starch, and other complex carbohydrates. Starch is a complex carbohydrate. Carbohydrates are an important energy source. We eat them largely to obtain energy, but you do need carbohydrates for structure in your body and your cells, and you can use carbohydrates also for making nucleic acids. Carbohydrates consist of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but not just any general formula. They have an exact formula that each carbohydrate will be having one carbon for two hydrogens and one oxygen. And then you just repeat that with an N. For example, glucose will have N as a 6, meaning it will be 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. And that's glucose. Sucrose would be N is equal to 12. 12 carbons, 24 hydrogens, and 12 oxygens. Simple sugars or strings of simple sugars linked together make a macromolecule, which in this case we call it a polysaccharide. Poly means many, saccharide is a sugar unit. So poly means many sugars or many monosaccharides. We can classify carbohydrates into 3 groups: a monosaccharide, that is one simple sugar like glucose or fructose; a disaccharide, and that's 2 monomers connected together to make a sugar that has 2 monomers in it. I don't know how to word it that way. An example of a disaccharide is sucrose, table sugar. Another would be lactose, milk sugar. There's maltose. You can find that sugar in molasses. That's a disaccharide. I'm sure I could think of a better one, but I can't think of one off the top of my head at the moment. And then a polysaccharide. Starch is probably the simplest polysaccharide. Starch, all it is a bunch of glucose units hooked together one after the other to make the starch, which is a polysaccharide. Any question about any of that? All right, so this slide is showing you the mono and disaccharides. All monosaccharides are simple sugars. They all are between 3 and 7 carbon atoms, but usually most monosaccharides are between 5 and 6 carbon units. Like glucose and fructose each have 6 carbons. Monosaccharides are sweet, they're water soluble. A disaccharide is formed by joining two monosaccharides together in dehydration synthesis. Like you can get glucose and fructose to come together and undergo dehydration synthesis. The water comes out, the OH of this glucose, the H of this fructose, to link this carbon directly to that oxygen of fructose. And that's sucrose, disaccharide. Any question about any of that? And then water comes out. And then when you eat table sugar, you will digest this link here by adding water in hydrolysis, where the water will be broken down into H, which will come to this oxygen, forming fructose, and the OH of the water will come to this carbon, binding there, forming glucose. Any questions about dehydration synthesis forming sucrose or hydrolysis forming glucose and fructose from sucrose? All right. Polysaccharides consist of many monomers or sugars or saccharides linked together one after the other. The polysaccharide may be straight or branch chains. Starch is, like I said, the simplest polysaccharide. All it is glucose hooked together one after the other, pretty much in a straight chain to be starch. Here's a bunch of starchy foods. I think everybody knows bread's a starchy food, cereal, pasta, rice, and potatoes. Everyone knows those are starchy foods. What you probably don't know is that beans and probably chestnuts, I don't know about chestnuts, but beans are about 1/3 carbohydrate, and that's mainly starch in the beans. Chestnuts are the same, similar. I'm not sure if it's 1/3, but close to it, probably. Glycogen is a similar molecule, a starch. The difference is, let me see if I can blow this up. Glycogen is glucose hooked together one after the other. It is a little different bond. And then the glycogen can be a branch chain, or it is a branch chain. Starch is mostly a single chain, straight chain, but glycogen will be a branching chain. Cellulose, we'll talk about that in a future lesson, but it is mainly a polysaccharide. Chitin we won't talk about. Actually, we'll talk about cellulose a little more in this lab. Sorry. Cellulose is a carbohydrate. And then another one we'll talk about in the future. This is the one I was thinking of, and that's peptidoglycan. It does have carbohydrates in it. It also has short peptides in it, which are not a carbohydrate. But peptidoglycan is partly carbohydrate, and we'll talk about that in a future lesson. Let me talk a little bit about cellulose. Let me blow this up as much as I can. Cellulose is a bunch of glucose hooked together one after another. And there's one row of it here and another row of it there. And that's a chemically covalent bond holding the glucose together, one to the other. This one to that one to both that one and that one. But cellulose also has hydrogen bonds between the glucose. And there's lots of hydrogen bonds in cellulose. This one bound to that one, this one bound to that one, hydrogen bond, this one bound to this one and to that one. All of these hydrogen bonds make cellulose difficult to digest, and that's why people cannot eat cellulose and digest it, whereas cows can. However, the cow itself does not digest the cellulose. The cow has microbes in its gut, and the microbes digest the cellulose to make glucose. The microbes share the glucose with the cow. Any question about any of that? All right. I think that's a good place to end. So I'm going to end the lesson there and ask, are there any questions? I will see some of you at the lab at 6:30. You're getting out 2 minutes early. I will see the rest of you at the next lecture.
Thank
Assuming
you. Have a good night.
Remember, I might be serving jury duty. I'll try and let you know as early as I know.
Okay, thank you. Have a good night.
You too.